Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer here at Daily Roto, bringing you another DraftKings cash game lineup review segment covering Week 5 of the NFL season and the 5 different cash game lineups that I entered in the massive $25 double up. As a resource for my cash game lineup construction every single week, I start with the projections over at Daily Roto. So let's start there. I've sorted for the Sunday slate and I've sorted at the QB position. Basically what I'm looking to do when I'm constructing multiple cash game lineups is figure out which players I'm going to use as a core in the lineups and which players I want to use as secondary players in lineups. So at the quarterback position, I'll usually like to use one or two quarterbacks during the course of the week. This week we had Dak Prescott, Aaron Rodgers, Phillip Rivers, Brian Hoyer, Alex Smith, who is no longer on that Sunday main slate, Russell Wilson, Carson Palmer, Eli Manning, Josh McCown. McCown was kind of interesting because at 4,500, he and Brian Hoyer were in a different price range altogether. I ended up using McCown in one cash game lineup, and it was a bit of a regrettable decision considering the other two quarterbacks I used were Dak Prescott and Brian Hoyer. The difference between Hoyer and McCown was certainly worth more than the $200 I saved, but every dollar kind of went far on a week where DraftKings pricing was very tight once again, and so I did use a little bit of McCown. Aaron Rodgers, just tough to fit in. He certainly delivered for his price tag, but 8,100 was very difficult to fit in on the slate. Phillip Rivers at 5,800 I felt like was a little bit more of a tournament play going on the road for one of those early starts. And so Hoyer and Dak were the two quarterbacks that I felt most comfortable with via our projections this week, and both wildly outperformed expectation. We projected Dak for 22. He scored like 30. We projected Hoyer for 16. He was up near 30 as well. So that was a good start to the positions. Got the quarterback position in pretty good shape. At the running back spot, the top 6 values for us were Le'Veon Bell, Ezekiel Elliott, Todd Gurley, Carlos Hyde, Melvin Gordon, and LeGarrette Blount. Le'Veon Bell was the guy that I really wanted to emphasize this week. There was a big gap in our value projections. We were projecting him for 27 points thanks to the Jaguars' weak run defense and his hefty workload in the passing game as well. Unfortunately, the Steelers decided to throw a lot more than we projected. You can see we projected about a 56-44 pass run distribution for Pittsburgh in this game. They were more like 70% pass, 30% run, which was very, very frustrating in a game that they were 7-point favorites, in a game that Jacksonville is a team that you should attack on the ground. Le'Veon Bell still kind of did his part with 10 catches, but only 19 DraftKings points was certainly a disappointment. I had Le'Veon Bell in 4 of my 5 cash game lineups. Ezekiel Elliott, I couldn't really find room for. It ended up being a little bit of no man's land for me between Gurley and Bell. So I ended up with 2 Gurleys, 4 Bells, and then from there, these were more playable running back prices. Carlos Hyde at 6,900, Melvin Gordon at 6,000, and LeGarrette Blount at 4,200. I ended up having a lot of LeGarrette Blount on this slate as a way to get salary relief to be able to afford mid-tier wide receivers. I ended up having a little bit of Melvin Gordon and a little bit of Carlos Hyde, and those were 2 players that we projected similarly in terms of value for their salary, but wildly different results. Obviously, Melvin Gordon was one of the slate winners with 37 DraftKings points. Carlos Hyde was a slate loser at 2 DraftKings points. And when we go through the individual lineups, you'll see some of the wide discrepancies between performance of the lineups simply attributed to the decision between those 2 players. And that's always a frustrating situation. It happened in Week 4 as well with Deshaun Watson and Trevor Siemian projected tightly together and Watson blowing Siemian away. And it's a decision maker that is ultimately frustrating when the results deviate so much from the process that you're using to make projections. So those were the 6 guys I considered for cash. I only used 5 of them. I did not use Ezekiel Elliott. At the wide receiver spot, we had Jarvis Landry, Rashard Matthews, T.Y. Hilton, Jordy Nelson, a little bit too expensive again for this slate. If I was paying over $8K, it was going to be for a volume running back. Dez Bryant, Pierre Garçon. Those were the guys I generally considered for cash on the slate. I was trying to stay in the 6K range. So I used a tight group of wide receivers. I used Jarvis Landry on all of my lineups. I used T.Y. Hilton on all of my lineups. They were the 2 wide receivers I'm most confident about. Rashard Matthews was a difficult one for us because Tennessee still had a decent implied total at 21. We projected a pretty run-heavy script for them, 52% of the time passing. We did project more passing touchdowns than rushing touchdowns. That's the way they've been a little bit. But what basically happened is we missed big time on the yards per target for Rashard Matthews and a little bit on the volume as well, as Matt Castle in the passing game just couldn't get anything going. I had played in our customizer with different levels for the yards per target. I had taken them all the way down to like 6 yards per target, and he still looked okay. So I did use a little bit of Rashard Matthews. It was one of the weaker points in the lineup construction process for me this week, but I felt like the volume was still going to be there for Tennessee in the passing game, and frankly it was. They just weren't very efficient at all. Under 5 yards per attempt for Matt Castle is pretty historically bad. Over at the tight end position, we had two clear-cut guys that were pretty close in terms of the value. Austin Seferian-Jenkins, who was the fantasy community's darling, and then Tyler Kroft, who had a big week the week before, was a little bit cheaper. We projected Austin Seferian-Jenkins for a higher market share of targets, a higher market share of reception touchdowns, but the Jets having a little bit lower implied total and Kroft having a little bit lower price tag, the Jets at 21.5, or excuse me, the same implied total, Cincinnati at 21 and a third. Really the lower price tag for Kroft and a little bit of a higher, historical reception rate kind of kept Tyler Kroft in the mix. Now, this ended up being a wide disparity, and because every dollar counts, the teams that I did use Kroft over Seferian-Jenkins were impeded. Over at the defensive spot, we had a very wide projection gap in terms of value with defenses. We had the Eagles way out in front of everybody else. Kansas City was not in the slate. The Jets were priced similarly. So it was basically, down to the Bills as a higher alternative. And perhaps we didn't give enough of a bump to teams that were facing backup quarterbacks like the Miami Dolphins or the Baltimore Ravens on the slate in terms of our projections on the defensive side. And that did hurt because that would have brought in some other teams that were a little bit cheaper than the Eagles that I could have considered. But as a result, I locked the Eagles defense on all 5 of my cash game lineups. I really felt their upside was immense. I thought their floor was very strong. And this also goes into the LeGarrette Blount play. I felt very confident that Philadelphia was going to play from ahead in the game against Arizona. So I felt like Blount would get a lot of opportunities to salt the game away. Felt like Blount would get a lot of opportunities in the red zone, as well as Philadelphia is historically a team that has leaned on the running game in the red zone to convert touchdowns. Over the last few years, they've been a little bit more run touchdown heavy than pass touchdown heavy as they've gone through Carson Wentz's development. It was obviously not the case this week. They scored 4 offensive touchdowns. Not one of them was through the rushing game, and LeGarrette Blount had a rushing touchdown called back due to a holding. That was a big buzzkill. So let's look at the actual roster construction. This was the highest scoring team that I had on the week at 165.64 in terms of the 5 cash game lineups I had. And basically, it had Dak, it had LeGarrette Blount, Melvin Gordon. I couldn't get up to Le'Veon Bell in this lineup because I wanted to emphasize these 3 receivers in the mid-tier. So I have Dez Bryant, T.Y. Hilton, and Jarvis Landry. As a reminder, the core for me was the Eagles defense, Jarvis Landry, T.Y. Hilton. They were on every team. So from there, it was just rotating around the few quarterbacks I liked, the few running backs I liked, and that tight end position, I wanted to get Seferian-Jenkins wherever I could, but if I didn't have enough money, I was okay pivoting down to Kroft. So the next highest team that I had was a similar team. Dak, Melvin, T.Y., Landry, Blount, Eagles. Only difference here is up from Gurley to Le'Veon, down from Dez to Rashard Matthews, and down from Austin Seferian-Jenkins to Tyler Kroft. Le'Veon didn't hold his weight in terms of paying up that big price tag, and as a result, the lineup kind of fell behind the other one. Then there was a big gap between my next 3 lineups. You can see a 30-point gap in just missing the cash line here at 131. The actual cash line was at 133. 65-68 is where I finished out of the top 6,000, doubled up here. And on these 131 teams, you can see I had Hoyer as opposed to Dak. The extra money from Hoyer allowed me to get up to Le'Veon Bell easier. Also allowed to get me from Melvin Gordon to Carlos Hyde and still have those receivers. So the difference between this team and the team that were in the 160s was Hoyer over Dak, Hyde over Gordon, which was a huge discrepancy, 35-point difference there. And then Evan Ingram over Blount. This was the one team I didn't go with Blount. I couldn't figure out where to get the $200 from, so I dropped down to Evan Ingram, who didn't catch a pass and was very disappointing. Obviously, when you're 2 points away from the cash line and one of your players gets a 0, it's extremely frustrating. When one of your running back gets 2.8, it's even more frustrating. So just missed there, and basically, in this instance, pretty close, but you just can't afford 2 duds like that in cash games and hoping to double up. From there, the next highest lineup I had was at 128.16, and this one is the Josh McCown over Brian Hoyer. This is basically that same lineup as you saw before with Lev, Hyde again, Bryant, Hilton, Landry, Austin Seferian-Jenkins. this is that $200 I couldn't get to Blunt for Ingram. I took it here and I dropped 200 to McCown. So again, very small tweaks on these lineups. This was a 3-point difference. Again, one LeGarrette Blunt touchdown, not called back, away from the cash line. And then the final lineup is 124 was my lowest. And this was a lineup that avoided Carlos Hyde, but it had the Rashard Matthews and Todd Gurley combination that, along with LeGarrette Blunt not finding that touchdown, was enough to kind of keep me from the cash line. So only 2 of my 5 cash lineups doubled up this week. A little bit of a losing week for me in the $25 double up. And a little bit frustrating because, the 2 lineups that cashed easily by, almost 30 points or more. And the other 3 lineups were just one play away from the cash line. And, different iterations that I messed around with included like a Duke Johnson, who I thought was okay for cash, but I liked Blunt a little bit more. Duke Johnson ended up being useless pretty much the whole game, and then catching a touchdown in the last minute on like a 40-yard play where the Jets missed a bunch of tackles. And so small differences, that play holds up, and LeGarrette Blunt's touchdown gets called back, and it's a huge difference in the cash line when decisions are relatively thin and margins are pretty thin. So that's this week's DraftKings cash game lineup review. As always, you can find all of our projections and all of our NFL content over at dailyroto.com. Those projections that I showed earlier were the foundation for the lineups that I build. They're the foundation for the lineups I build every week. We play what we project, and we play what we recommend. So check us out over at dailyroto.com. Hopefully some of these cash game lineups and the different iterations and combinations I can create off of a small, tight player pool help those of you who are trying to smooth out some of the variance in your cash game results by using multiple lineups. Helps give you some ideas about how I go about building them. So good luck in week 6. Best of luck in all the games that you play during the course of the DFS season. And I will see you guys next time for another cash game lineup review for DraftKings.